Lovely. Diolch yn fawr. Thank you, Gemma. So this session is part of our Communicating Digital Community of Practice. So some of you may be members, but some of you may not be. But the Community of Practice has been set up to support digital and communications teams, either involved in digital transformation or who are interested in digital transformation. It's about sharing ideas and practice, sharing what's good, what's not so good, but also providing practical support and food for thought. And since this is a lunchtime session, hopefully you've all managed to grab a bite of lunch to have during this session as well. I'm delighted to welcome Giles Turnbull. Giles is the author of Agile Comms Handbook, which is a fantastic read, highly recommend. And Giles is going to lead the session today. We talk about working in the open as a key principle of digital transformation, but I know it doesn't come naturally to a lot of us, and it's certainly new to me as head of comms to the CDPS over the last couple of months. So who better to talk to us about it than Giles? So Giles, I'm going to hand over to you. Your presentation will take about half an hour. So if you have any questions, you can either pop them in the chat now or just wait until the end. So Giles, over to you.
Okay, thank you very much, Edwina. Hello, everybody. I'm just going to do the inevitable clicks of doom to get my presentation and stuff up on screen in the right way. So hopefully now you should be able to see my slides with me on top. So Edwina, if you could give me a little thumbs up that that's true, yes. And I'm going to switch off my Zoom video so that you only see one of me rather than two of me. And hopefully that will work and I can talk to you. So hi, Brynhandar, I'm Giles. I'm on level 2 on Duolingo, so that's the best Welsh you're going to get out of me today. My streak is at about 50 something days so far, so not bad. I am particularly happy to be talking to you lot today from CDPS, organised by CDPS, because I really love Wales. I spent a lot of time on this beach when I was a child and on similar beaches like it. And a piece of me is still left behind there, quite frankly. And I would very much like to be spending more time there if I possibly could. But I can't. I'm in Wiltshire, so that'll have to do. I run a tiny, tiny little consulting company called Use the Human Voice. And my whole thing is helping organizations communicate more like humans do. As part of that, I recently wrote and published this book, the Agile Comms Handbook, as Edwina was just telling you. It's really an attempt on my part to write down the things that I say repeatedly in meetings. And it's not exhaustive. It doesn't cover everything. It doesn't cover much in much detail. It's quite a short book, and that was a deliberate choice. Also made it easier to write. But it's a quick read, and it sort of skims over the surface of some useful things that you can think about and do to make your comms move a bit faster, a bit more like the pace of the actual work that you're doing, that you're communicating about. So if you want to buy a copy, that's the URL to go to, agilecommshandbook.com. It's 15 quid plus a couple of quid to ship it in the UK, a few more pounds if you need to ship it further afield than that. As some of you know, and I've seen some familiar faces in the list of names, I used to work for the government. I'm sure quite a lot of you did as well, or probably still do. I worked for the bit that was doing gov.uk, and as I'm sure many of you already know, that started out as an effort to turn hundreds of websites, over 1,800 of them, that all looked and behaved differently, and turn them into one, which was gov.uk, that I'm sure most of you are already familiar with us as well. The team that was doing that, the Government Digital Service, was guided by this set of principles. I think I saw Di Vaughan on the call earlier, and Di was one of the people who shaped these, I'm pretty sure, he's waving. And these principles guided everybody's work there. And my job, the team that I was part of, was mainly concerned with number 10. Make things open, it makes things better. That's principle number 10, not number 10, the street address. We didn't have a lot to do with that. And these principles guided our work. If we were following these principles, we were probably doing the right thing most of the time. And in the spirit of making things open to make things better, we did a lot of work like writing loads of blog posts. We did things like organizing events. We made quite a lot of videos and stuck them up on YouTube, not so that we could become a big YouTube channel, but really so that we could use YouTube as a storage system, and then embed the videos in other contexts, quite often in event videos, up on big screens in front of audiences, using them a lot in presentations and embedding them in blog posts, things like that. And the same team wrote a lot of ephemera, a lot of catchphrases and one-liners and stickers and posters. And this is one of the posters that I'm most proud of, the It's Okay poster, which was created to help newcomers to GDS understand the culture a bit better. It was essentially a list of things that it's useful to know about, but that it's nobody's job to tell you. And this idea has been quite popular. It got copied and borrowed and remixed by various other organizations, various other governments, most recently by Google, who did their own version earlier this year. They changed some of the words, but they didn't change the color, because the color is already perfect. It was designed by Sonia Turcotte, who was one of the designers on the team. So in the spirit of that poster, and given that it is lunchtime, please eat your lunch while you're listening to me waffle on. I'm very cool with that. Feel free to go to the loo, make notes or not, do all of these things, that's fine. You can ask me questions now, or you can wait to the end of the waffling and rambling bit and then ask them at the end. And appreciate, of course, lots of you will probably have 2 o'clock meetings. So if you need to disappear before the end, please do that. Okay, the useful bit. I can't tell you everything that's in the book because we don't have time for that, even though it is a short book. But maybe I can talk you through 5 useful tips to think about when you're thinking about applying Agile comms. The first of these is to look for things that need more layers of explanation. In the book, I talk about, well, I start the book really with a hypothesis of mine, which I think is true, and I have yet to find somebody who really strongly disagrees with me on this. And it's this: everyone is already too busy most of the time. Most of the people that we are communicating to about our work are already too busy. We are already too busy doing the work. Any of the stakeholders who are involved are probably already too busy. So it makes sense to take that into account when we're communicating with people. It's a good idea to recognize that other people to whom we are trying to communicate have limited time, have limited mental cognitive capacity to take in more or new information. So we need to work in a way that recognizes that and takes into account. And a good way to do that is to break information, to break communication up into layers. The detail, the stuff that we're communicating about, usually exists by default. It's just there. It's the output of the work. So this detail stuff at the bottom, you never really need to worry about putting effort into creating it, because it's already been created. It's the result of the work that the team was doing. But those other layers, the context layer, which is something that gives people the basics, and the lure layer, the top layer, the beckoning finger that invites people in and gives them a reason to pay attention to in the first place. The thing about those 2 layers is that they don't always exist by default. In fact, quite often in a lot of organizations, it's nobody's job to create them. It's not been written down in anybody's job description that they have to think about these things and think about creating them. So this is the first tip: is look around you, look around your organization, look around the work that you're doing and the communication efforts that are going on, and think to yourself, what is it that we're sending out to people at the moment? Are we sending out stuff that really belongs here in the detail layer? Is there something that we could do proactively to create additional layers of stuff on top? And ask yourself as well, whose job is that? Does it need to be a regular part of somebody's job to think about that? Is it my job? Do I have to do that? It's good if somebody in your team or in your organization is paying attention to that and thinking about who's going to do that, who's going to invest that time to think about whether or not those other layers of communication exist, who and how who should create them and how should they be created, and what should they look like, what context, what format should they be in, and the likely answer to that is that they will be in a different format depending on what it is you're saying, who it is you're saying it to, and what it's about. So layers is the first tip. The second one is experimenting with ideas in bad first drafts. This is another thing that I talk about quite a lot in the book, is giving yourself the freedom to write something really terrible as your first draft and not beat yourself up about it. Also, not to worry if your teammates or your colleagues or the people who report to you are also writing bad first drafts. In fact, to encourage that behavior. Why? Because another hypothesis of mine is that all first drafts are bad. This is a universal constant in the universe. How do we know this? Because every great novelist knows this. Every journalist, every writer of any sort knows that their first draft is not going to be bad. The worlds of journalism and book writing and authoring are shaped. These professions are shaped around the idea that the first drafts will not be very good. Tolkien knew this when writing The Lord of the Rings. One of the nice things about Tolkien's approach was that he kept all his early drafts. He was writing in longhand on paper, and he kept those old bits of paper and filed them away. And years later, his children and grandchildren went through those early drafts and looked at the alternative universes that Tolkien considered when he was writing his book. Now, apologies to anybody who has either never read the book and never watched any of the movies. I'm assuming most of you are probably familiar with one, if not both. The thing here about Tolkien was that here are our heroes from The Lord of the Rings that most of us will know and be very familiar with. The hobbits on one side, Frodo, Sam, Pippin and Merry, and their guides, their mentors on the other side, Aragorn and Gandalf. But of course, in the early drafts of The Lord of the Rings, they had different names. And Frodo was called Bingo, which would have been a terrible name for the ring bearer, in my opinion. And Aragorn was called Trotter and wasn't actually Aragorn. In the early drafts, Aragorn was Bilbo from The Hobbit, the previous novel, and Gandalf was called Bledorthin. And you can see all of this stuff got changed later on, and thank goodness it did. But what's more, when Tolkien started writing the book, there was no magic ring. He sent off his hobbits on a wild adventure, and he didn't know why. And he figured this out after writing a few chapters and working out at that point, hang on, why am I sending these hobbits off on this adventure? What's the point? What's the purpose? What's driving this action? And he thought, no, I've got to go back. I've got to rewrite these early drafts. I've got to think of something. And that was the moment when he went back to his earlier novel, The Hobbit, and he thought, hang on, what about this magic ring that turns you invisible? What if it was like evil and stuff? And that's where The Lord of the Rings came from. So I write like this as well. Most of my writing time is spent in Google Docs, and very, very often this is the practical consequence of me writing in bad first drafts. I leave comments like this on Google Docs that I share with other people, where I confess, quite frankly and brutally, I have no idea what I'm doing. Quite often when I don't know the facts, I will genuinely write fiction into a document simply to have something to share, simply so that I can show people my bad first draft and say, look, this is really bad. It's full of mistakes. It's full of holes. I've actually been making stuff up halfway through because I didn't know everything. What do you think? Give me your feedback. If bad drafts were okay for Tolkien, then I think they're okay for the rest of us. And that means that we can all benefit from having the freedom to write something really awful and not worry about it. It gives you superpowers. It means that you can write more freely. You don't have to worry too much about getting it good. There's a really nice quote from an American author. This is also in the book, if you've read the book. She says, when I'm writing a first draft, I'm just putting sand in a bucket so I can build the sandcastle later. Absolutely right. This is a brilliant way of approaching writing pretty much anything, in my opinion. And maybe Shannon Hale is writing drafts on Trefluffin Beach in Pembrokeshire. Maybe not, I don't know. I would be if I had the chance. Let's go on to another tip. start collecting things to show. Now, those of you who are vaguely familiar with the realm of government comms over the last few years, you may have seen or heard this catchphrase, show the thing. Show the thing guided a lot of the work of the government digital service in the early days. It wasn't on that list of principles that I showed you, but it was sort of implicit and kind of explicit in various contexts elsewhere. And we did make this bright red poster that was up all over the place. The point of showing the thing was that when it helped us focus our efforts, our communication efforts, on actually talking about the work, not about plans for the work. So, for example, when a team, as a form of governance, when teams had completed work on, say, an alpha of a digital service of some kind, they were encouraged to get a senior stakeholder, a minister, if possible, to sit down in front of a laptop and actually play with the prototype, hold a mouse, click the buttons, see how it operated. That was an aspect of showing the thing. But so was blogging, doing presentations that were nice and clear, making all those videos. We were trying to show the work as it was happening, even when it wasn't finished yet. But to do that, to show the things, you have to collect things to show. You have to get into the habit of gathering them and storing them in a safe place. And this is a screenshot of an actual folder on my Mac. I have several folders like this where I save things. I take screenshots all the time. I take photographs when there aren't pandemics happening and we're allowed to go into offices and meet people. I take photographs of those things happening. I take photographs of interesting things that I see on walls. I grab even more screenshots and I throw them into a folder like this, and 90% of them never see the light of day again. But a few weeks later, maybe a few months later, sometimes even years later, I might be writing something, or someone on the team might be writing something about that work. And that's the point where I can pipe up and say, haha, I have a screenshot of that. That is another fantastic superpower for doing agile comms. If you in the past gets into the habit of collecting these things and squirreling them away in a folder somewhere, then you in the future will be thankful for it. You in the future will look back and say, thank goodness that me in the past was so smart. So make this a habit. Make this something that the whole team does by default. Make this something that is encouraged. Say to the team, take lots of pictures, grab lots of screenshots, save other things too, links, quotes, bits of paper, video snippets, all sorts of stuff. It doesn't matter what it is, as long as it helps you show the thing in future. Grab lots of it. Another tip is about slides and presentations. And forgive me one moment while I take a sip of water. So there is a short section in the book talking about how to present things and how to do presentations generally. In my opinion, and I argue this in the book, there are really two broad kinds of presentation. There's the kind that I call a type 1, like this that I'm doing right now, where you are presenting stuff to an audience, either in person, face-to-face, or over a video call, like I'm doing today. So in those circumstances, your slides are illustrations. They are visual accompaniments to what comes out of your mouth. That's a type 1 presentation. Then there's also another kind, there's a type 2 presentation, which is where people use PowerPoint to write stuff down. Personally, I don't think that that's the best way of writing things down. I think if you want people to read a document, you should give them a document that's easy to read. And I prefer to do that in something shaped like that is a document that's designed for reading. But quite a lot of people prefer to do it in a document shaped like that and do it in a series of slides. Fine, I get that. It helps sometimes to be able to write that way and to structure your thoughts and to move them around. I get how that is useful for people. The main problem with doing presentations that I have encountered most in government is when somebody creates a presentation of one sort or the other and then uses it for the other thing. So if you create a type 1 presentation, which is mostly going to be pictures and a handful of words on each slide like this one, and then you give that to somebody to read by email, they're going to say, well, there's not much to read here. Why are you sending me this? But equally, if you create a type 2 presentation, which is mostly words, you know, they often have diagrams in them like this, or they might have slides in them like this. These are things that are designed and written to be read. But then if you put this up on a slideshow in a type 1 presentation, like what I'm doing now, and skip on before people have had time to read the content of the slide, then you know that people haven't been able to take in what was on the slide and what was coming out of your mouth at the same time. So my point about presentations is to consider the user need and always think to yourself, what are the circumstances in which this presentation will be delivered or handed over or actually presented? If it's going to be presented in a room or virtually to a bunch of people with a speaker, then most of the slides need to be illustrative. If it's already a type 2 presentation, if it's already written to be read, then that means I have to do extra work. I have to make another version of the same slides that's mostly pictures. And the same applies in the opposite direction. If you've already done one that's mostly pictures, and then you want to send structured thoughts to other people to read, you probably have to make another set of slides that is designed for readability. User needs apply everywhere, even in comms, even in presentations. I could bang on about this for hours, but I won't. You'll be relieved to hear. There are 2 things that I'd recommend you have a look at if you're interested in finding out more about doing good presentations. One is a website I made a few years ago. It's not very well designed because I'm not a designer, but the text is worth reading. It's an aggregation of various things written by myself and some other colleagues who know a lot about presentations. That's at doingpresentations.com. The other thing that you should look at is Russell Davies' book that just came out a few weeks ago. Everything I Know About Life, I Learned from PowerPoint. It is very, very good. And Russell is also one of the contributors at doingpresentations.com. So you can get a double dose of Russell there if you need to. On to the final tip. You only need to be a tiny bit creative to stand out from the crowd and to make your voice heard, particularly to the people, those busy people. Remember, everybody's already too busy. How do you get that lure layer, that uppermost layer, to affect people, to make them stop and think, wait a minute, should I bother to carve out 20 minutes of my life to pay attention to this new thing? Maybe I should. How do you get people to do that? By being a little bit creative. You don't have to go wild, just a tiny bit of creativity makes all the difference. This isn't my observation. This was something that I borrowed from Simon Willison. Simon is a technologist. He's a Brit, but he's based in the US. And he wrote this blog post earlier this year talking about how he was hiring people to join his company. And the ones that stood out in the hiring process were the people who added just a tiny bit of creative spark to their CV or resume. And that was what made him want to hire those people rather than the actual content of the resume. You can see this sprinkling of creativity in all sorts of places when you start to look for it. This is one of my favorite examples. This is from Monzo Bank. Monzo is one of those new banks that is mainly just an app on your phone rather than a shop in the high street. And Monzo sent out this email earlier this year about terms and conditions. Now, I wouldn't blame you if you never bother to read any emails about terms and conditions. Most people don't. Most people never bother to read actual terms and conditions either. But this paragraph from Monzo really struck me because they say, they're talking about a change to their T's and C's. And they say, we'll refund you for loss or damage in some cases, but not others. And then they follow up with this ingenious paragraph. We know that's vague, sorry. What we are and aren't responsible for is quite fiddly to explain in this email. It's all in the terms and conditions if you're interested. Such art on display here. This is absolute genius. A tiny bit of creativity using language like quite fiddly to talk about something boring like terms and conditions. And you know, when you're reading this, there is an instant additional layer of trust and respect. You know that Monzo is respecting your time. by saying, look, you probably don't need to read this, you probably don't want to read this, but if you do want to, here it is, here's the link. You can see the link is the last line of the email there. I think this email is a work of art. Other examples of tiny bits of creativity. There is a program going on in government at the moment called Future Farming, which is all about effectively replacing funding from the EU for farming and farmers that is disappearing because we're no longer part of the EU. So government has to do something about that. It is setting up all sorts of new schemes. This is an enormous piece of work. It's very complicated. There is a lot of communication to be done, particularly to the farming community, to tell them what's changing, why it's changing, how it's changing. The team working on this program have been really good at being open about what they know and what they don't know. And just a tiny thing that they did recently was they grabbed this video and they put it on their blog. This isn't even their video. It was made by another production company, but it happened to include an interview with Janet Hughes, who is the leader of the program. That production company put the video on YouTube, but they made sure that it was embeddable. So that meant that the team at DEFRA were able to embed that video made by somebody else into their website. It's a tiny little creative little spark, but it adds a lot. Another little example is the early days of gov.uk. Di Vaughan will probably recognize this as well. I think we might even have written it, but I think it was Richard Pope who wrote this one. In the early days of the gov.uk alpha, the team were allowed and encouraged to blog daily, as much as they wanted, about what was on their mind. And if you go back to the early months of 2011, it's all still there in the archive, and you read through those early blog posts, you will see that they sound like a tiny team of about 14 people working on something new and exciting. And you can read it in the language that they use. It comes across really well. There's a little bit of creative freedom here that you don't see very often, and it brings it to life. It makes it more accessible. It makes it more interesting. It's more likely to work as a lure to make people interested. Okay, I've been talking for about half an hour, which is far too long. Thank you for listening to me. Please buy my book if you like. Now's the time to ask me questions. You can put them in the chat, and I'm going to grab another swig of water while Ed finds one to throw at me. Thank you. I'll stop sharing.
Lovely. Thank you so much. That was really interesting, Giles, and some really practical tips there as well. I think one of the things that you said that really resonated was the fact that we need to consider user needs when we're doing presentations. Like, we talk about it for service design, but something as simple as doing presentations, making sure that we're considering the needs of the user, really, really important. Are there any questions for Giles? So raise your hand or pop it in the chat. I'm just going to give people a couple of seconds to think about that. And while they are, I have one for you, and it's around the layering that you talked about. So especially the lure layer. And, you know, as a communications professional, you almost think that that's your job to come up with that, to come up with the thing that is going to lure. And it's not always easy because you're not always involved in all of the conversations or don't have the bigger picture, I suppose. So where have you seen that working really well, and what types of I suppose, yeah, what types of teams or team structure would you say where that works well for, where you know, we can get the lure layer with as easy as possible, I suppose?
At a team level, I'd say good lures are the kinds of lures where you don't have to get approval from 6 layers of management above you, where you are already empowered and enabled to come up with a snappy catchphrase that sums up your own work. That's a really helpful thing. Places where I've seen it working are quite often in my own inbox. So when you're looking at your own inbox of 10,000 emails that have come in over the past week while you were on holiday, and you're looking at all these subject lines, a good lure can be as simple as a really interesting subject line on an email. It could be something, there was another government department that I was working for a few years ago where we were trying to lure people into coming to a show and tell, a meeting to talk about work that had been done recently. But show and tells in that particular organization were quite a new idea. People weren't familiar with the concept. So when we sent out an invitation, we made sure that that subject line, I'm now struggling to remember what the exact words were, but we made sure that that subject line was something enticing, something that would stand out in people's inboxes and really make them jump and say, oh, yeah, okay, I'll sacrifice an hour of my day to come along and listen to that. I think it helped that we were offering cake, but it always does, doesn't it? Other good lures, the classic example from most of the government work that I've been doing recently has been that you treat social media more like the lure, you treat blogging more like the context, and both of those things sort of guide people in a line towards the detail, which might often live on a page on gov.uk or perhaps in a spreadsheet or a PDF or something like that. But rather than sending the spreadsheet or the PDF up front, you guide people towards it through those other layers.
Lovely, thank you. A couple of questions coming in. Jonty, do you want to come off mute and ask your question, please?
Sure, thanks, Edwina. Hi, Giles, that was great. Really loved listening to you. I work with lots of teams in big corporates, some of whom are quite kind of straight-laced. How would you think about encouraging people to share bad first drafts, kind of shifting the culture to have a bit of more safety around being open around, poor first drafts, like you say?
The first thing is lead by example. Make it something that leaders do. Make sure that when leaders are writing things, they also acknowledge that their first drafts will be bad, and they share them downwards with their team. And they say, "Hey team, here's something that's been on my mind for the last few days. Please have a look at this and tell me what you think. I don't think I know that I haven't got this all right. What have I forgotten? What have I missed?" So that's one thing. And make it regular, make it a habit, make it something that is sort of built into the team cadence of work. That's another useful thing, because then the more people who get round to sharing their bad first drafts, the better. If that's happening regularly, then more people will just do it automatically, because it almost becomes, I wouldn't say make it somebody's turn every week, because that feels like too much pressure. But especially if everybody's saying, yeah, I'm cool with sharing my first drafts, then the people who are less happy about doing that will hopefully feel happy, and the more they see others doing it. Another way I have found of encouraging people to do it is by talking about it in terms of the freedom it gives you. It actually makes it easier to write your first draft if there is less pressure on your shoulders when you're doing it. A lot of people who aren't professional writers, they open up Word or Google Docs and they have this big empty white box to fill with words, and that's quite a lot of pressure for some people. Some people really hate that feeling of, oh heavens, I have to fill this with words now, what am I going to do? If you say to people up front, if you as a leader or as an organization, if you say, look, it doesn't matter if your first draft is 6 bullet points and a picture of a cat, that's fine. We don't care how bad it is. In fact, another tip is to encourage people to make it worse and say, look, make your first draft even worse. Make it as bad as you can. We want this to happen. We don't expect polish up front. So setting those expectations, leading by example, and making it a habit, I think are all useful things.
Lovely, thank you. That's really good.
Yeah. Jonty's point about psychological safety is mirrored by Maria's point in the comment box, where she says, it's really soul destroying when it comes back red penned, and for that individual who's put it out there. Is there another way of doing it where maybe the onus isn't just on the one person? Would you encourage team writing or pairs writing or anything like that, so a draft is not just from one person who might feel, oh, I can't put that out there? What are your thoughts on that?
Yes, I would encourage definitely teams to share stuff with one another. That is a really good idea. And when I was working, in fact, in most of the teams that I've worked with for the past few years, I've got into the habit of sharing bad drafts early on with as many people as possible, sharing them with wild abandon to anyone who I think might have an opinion about how to make them better. So I've definitely found that useful, because getting lots of input is useful. Another thing that has been useful at a team level is saying to people, and in response to Maria's point there about the psychological safety and the red pen all over things, when I'm sharing drafts with people, I quite often say, here's my first bad draft. Please don't edit. I actually say that explicitly. I don't want you to open Word and start typing. No, please just read it and tell me what's wrong. Tell me what's missing verbally, ideally. You know, if we're all working in an office and there aren't any pandemics happening, come over, let's have a chat and a cup of coffee and tell me what needs to change rather than diving into the document. I absolutely know how you feel, Maria, and I have been there too, drowning in comments in a document. And the more people you've shared it with, the more comments pile up. And there's very often no sense of what belongs in those comments and what doesn't. And so you end up with people calling you out about spelling mistakes and you've forgotten a comma here. And are you sure you want to use that semicolon? Yes, I am. But you get a lot of that stuff mixed in with really big things like structural stuff. You know, this point here, maybe this should be the intro, or this paragraph here, it doesn't really make sense. Do we need to rethink it? That kind of stuff is the most useful feedback. That's the good stuff to get early on for the first bad draft. The spelling and the grammar, which usually gets mixed in with everything else, I always say, leave it to the end. Let's worry about that later.
And lots of people agreeing with you in the chat there
cool.
as well. We've got a question from Stuart Thompson. Stuart's like me, new to Agile Comms, and he said it's been a real learning curve. Stuart, do you want to come off mute and ask your question?
Hello, Giles. Hello.
Hello.
So my question is that given that you're working in an agile way, has there been any piece of feedback on the book so far that's made you want to completely rewrite
it? Yes. There's been readers have pointed out at least 4 like dumb errors which I want to fix. You know, there's a couple of places where there's a word that missing or a word in there that shouldn't be, stuff like that. But yes, at a higher level, there is more stuff that I would like to say about certain topics and less stuff that I'd like to say about others. So quite a lot of people have said to me, is there an ebook? And the answer has so far been no, but I would like to create an ebook version. And what I'm looking at doing is making that effectively a second edition. The beauty of the slightly awkward DIY system that I have adopted for this whole publishing adventure is that when I do that, I'll also be able to update the print version as well, because I'm getting it printed in relatively small batches. So there will be some updates, probably not till sometime next year because #work, and I will hopefully get an ebook version out, and it will have a bit more about presentations, a bit less about blogging, and some other bits and bobs as well.
Thank you, Giles. I've just put a call out for more questions while we wait. So working in the open, it's one of our digital service standards at CDPS,
Yep.
not something that people are, I suppose, familiar with or used to doing. What advice would you give somebody starting out blogging for the first time? What kind of platforms do you put it on? You know, people I'm sure are thinking, I know I certainly have in the past, but nobody's going to be interested in what I have to say. So what advice would you give somebody starting out?
Start is tip number 1. Start and don't worry about the audience. Don't worry about the number of people who will be reading it. For most of us, most of the time, that number will be very small and it's likely to stay small for a while. But you're not blogging to build an audience. You're blogging to put your thoughts out in the public domain in some kind of logical or chronological order so that you in the future can refer back to them. And maybe other people in the future can refer back to them as well. One of the things about blogging is that you're building up a narrative over time. You're starting at the beginning when you know what's happening this week, but you have no idea what will be happening 6 months from now. If you make blogging a habit because you've started and you just keep going, maybe once a week, once a fortnight, doesn't really matter, might even just be once a month. 6 months from now, you will have a narrative. You will have a story of work that you've been doing that has built up over time. And what's more, you'll have individual little stories within that narrative. And then you in the future, you have a new ability. You can now link back to one of those stories. You can point people to it, and you're in a position then to answer people's questions with URLs. And this, I love doing this. This is amazing. When you're in a meeting and somebody says, but what about the strategy? You can say, yeah, I've written about the strategy. Here's a blog post. Here's the URL. Go and have a look. And because you're blogging about it, because it's you're doing it in an agile way, if your strategy changes next week, you can write another blog post and you can say, well, here's what we thought a few months ago. Here's what we think today. Here's how those two things are different. And here's why. We've changed our mind because. Blogging is brilliant for many things. And one of those things is that it allows you to demonstrate that you are capable of changing your mind at an organizational level. And it gives you a platform for explaining why. You said what kind of platforms to publish on. Doesn't really matter. The choice of publishing platform isn't the issue. Just choose one, just start. It doesn't matter if you don't have much to say. It doesn't matter if you skip a week. There are no real rules about it. What really helps is that you're having a go and trying it and getting into some kind of rhythm that suits you and the team and the work you're doing, and looking towards that end goal months or even years ahead. What narrative will you be able to tell once you know what the story is? And at the beginning of a piece of work, you won't know. You will have hopes and expectations about what that narrative will be, but reality will inevitably interfere and change the story as it goes along. But if you're blogging regularly, you can adapt to that and tell that story as it changes. Di, I can see you've got a hand up.
Hi, Giles. A bit of a loaded question, which Anne's hinted to in the comments as well. Like, are there sort of other techniques or simple things that teams and individuals can do to start sort of talking about the work they're doing, or show or share what they're working on with other teams and people?
Apart from blogging, do you mean?
Apart from blogging.
Right. I mentioned show and tells earlier at that government department that I was part of a few years ago. You don't have to call them show and tells. Some people don't like that name, so fine, that's fine. Call them something else. Running some kind of regular, low-key, low-pressure update where you effectively open your team up to people coming in. You say, look, we're going to be doing a show and tell or a update session, if you want to call it that, every Friday afternoon from 3 to 4. Please drop in if you fancy it. Effectively enabling office hours for your team. You don't need all of your team there every time. It doesn't matter if for the first few occasions you only get 2 people turning up. That's fine. Again, it's about establishing a pattern and about establishing a rhythm. The more you do it, the more people will become to expect that it's happening. And the more often you do it and the more you share about your work, particularly in a larger organization, the word will spread. It might spread slowly, but the word will spread. And eventually people might start copying you and saying, yeah, we're going to do a team update as well. And the more of that you can enable and empower, the better. So some kind of regular update, keeping it low key and low pressure is quite important. I always say to people, if you're spending more than half an hour preparing for a show and tell, you're probably spending too much time, because the whole point of one of those sessions is you're telling people what you already know. You shouldn't have to be thinking through what you're going to say, because you should know it in your head. You've been part of the work, part of the team during the week or fortnight or month that's just happened. You know what story to tell about that. And crucially, if you've been collecting things to show during that time, then you will have all the images you need to just slap onto a bunch of slides really quickly. It shouldn't take you very long to prepare for that. So that's one thing. Writing week notes is another one. Week notes are a common technique for writing in public. You could call them a variety of blog post. You don't have to treat them like that. a week note is a really useful format for a lot of teams. It's also a useful format for people in leadership positions, or just anybody working in a team who wants to keep a diary effectively, but not necessarily keep it private. Week notes are a great way of sharing your thoughts, with your sharing your progress to date with a particular audience. They work well within small organizations. They can work well within big ones as well if they are published in some way where everybody can see them. If you can publish them in the public realm, great. Most teams won't be able to do that because they're usually working on something that's secret, but maybe there's a way you can publish them internally so that people can see them. And you don't have to go to any great lengths to do this, because it could just be a Google Doc. That's all it needs to be. Nothing special, nothing advanced. Sorry, I'm rambling a bit there. I hope that helps you, Di.
Thank you, Giles.
Any more?
We have a question from Amelia. Amelia, do you want to come off mute?
Sorry about that, it was a bit slow to come off mute. Yeah, in previous places I've been where we've wanted to share something that hasn't gone well, and I'm user researcher, so it's slightly different to other people here, but there's been pushback from other parts of the team or more senior people because they don't want to look bad, to look like we've done something wrong or we didn't know what we were doing. But actually, obviously, you think there's a value in saying this didn't work, so then we tried something else. So just sort of tips around how to persuade people that that's worthwhile, if you think it's worthwhile.
Oh, I really, really do. And I always say to especially when I'm one of a small group of people trying to persuade somebody senior that this kind of communication should be allowed. And they often express that exact fear. You know, we don't want to be confessing that we've made mistakes. And I say, yes, you do. Yes, you do. You really, really do. Because if it shows some kind of corporate emotional maturity in order to be able to just say, look, we don't get it all right all the time. But also it lets you focus the what you're saying, not necessarily on the mistake, but on what you've learned from it and how you've responded. And that's the beauty of documenting your mistakes in the public realm. There's a famous example from the early days of GDS when they were building the Gov.uk beta, I think it was, and there was a bunch of icons that appeared on various pages, and various bits of work had been done to design these icons and work out which one should go on which page and all that stuff. And then some research was done, probably by a user researcher just like yourself, and it turned out that none of the users realized what the icons meant. The icons were meaningless to most of the users. So somebody decided, yes, oh, thank you, Di, he's found the link already. Somebody said, yes, okay, let's ditch the icons. And the icons were removed overnight. Somebody wrote a blog post about it. Di has just helpfully slapped that URL into the chat. This is a great example, in my view, of an organization saying, whoops, we got it wrong. We'll do better. We've learned, we've moved on. Because they talk in the blog post about what they have learned. The blog post is not a blog post about a mistake. It is about how the organization is getting better at doing research and responding to needs. That, I think, is the benefit of writing like that. So I always share that link with people who are saying, well, we don't want to do this.
Great question, Amelia. And we can already see, Giles, what you mean about responding with a blog post for further reading. So that's super useful. Are there any more questions? You've sort of alluded to it in terms of the role of leadership. Apart from leading by example, what else would you say that leaders need to do to enable this type of culture and enable this type of working in the open to happen?
Let it happen. This is basically the concluding chapter of the book is about permission. And I was actually thinking about this again just this morning. I can't remember why, but one of the things about all of the work that the Government Digital Service did from 2011 onwards, and all of the work that has followed on sort of in a sort of domino effect across the UK public sector since then, all of that was kind of enabled because GDS was given permission, not because GDS was doing anything desperately radical. The technology wasn't wasn't amazing technology. It was the basic bog standard technology of using the web. Agile ways of working, that was not a new idea when GDS was doing it. It had been around for ages before that. Other organizations had been using it for a long time. Working in the open, blogging about your work as you do it. That was not a new idea in government. The point was permission was granted. The GDS back then was given permission ultimately by the minister who set the ball rolling, Francis Maud. He said, you are allowed to do these things. And so another thing that I encourage organizations to do if they want to enable agile comms is to think about, well, okay, what permission do we need in place? Who needs to decide that we're allowed to do these things? Does that person agree with this or not? And then there's a step, there's a decision to make. Well, if that person doesn't agree, how can we persuade them? How can we say to them, look, we think that there are benefits here. Will you please give us the permission that we need from you? So permission is what enables it all ultimately. And it's a big step, but it's a small thing. It doesn't need a lot for someone in a senior position to declare, yes, I will let the team communicate in its own terms, in its own words, in its own way, at its own pace about the work that it is doing. And the more teams that are there doing that work, the better, because you're like freeing up loads of different bits of comms all at once.
Thank you. And I suppose organisations share in the benefits, such as the discussions that we're having in the community of practice will help. So on that, Giles, just to say, Diolch yn fawr iawn, thank you very much for your time. I'm going to hand to Gemma, who's just going to close the session for us and give some more information on the community practice if people are interested. So thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Giles, for today. Some really, really good advice and guidance. I was going to ask afterwards, can you send me some resources which I can circulate within the community, because I know that you've got a few different things with like friends who've written books and stuff. So the community actually meets monthly. Our December meeting isn't going ahead because it's December. Our next meeting is going to be Wednesday, the 26th of January at 1 o'clock. We're open to everybody. We've set up in July in order to help comms professionals navigate digital transformation. So everybody's welcome. We have a mailing list. I've got people who want to sign up. You can join in or you can just stay on the mailing list. It's completely up to you. But yeah, our next meeting is the Wednesday, 26th of January, and we'll be releasing our plan for 2022. I think the next meeting is going to be lots of discussion on how we've applied some of your tips, Giles, because yeah, it's been really interesting. So yeah, I think we're done. So thank you again, everybody. The recording is going to be circulated, so keep your eyes peeled on social media. And yeah, thanks very much.
Thanks, everyone. Bye for now.
Bye-bye.